right, welcome everyone to our CapSource webinar. We're excited that you're all with us here today. We hope to make this interactive and engaging. We have such incredible speakers calling in from all over the world, totally different programs with very unique perspectives, and I think it's going to create a nice dialogue here. Ultimately, all centered around experiential education. All of our speakers are profiled experiential educators. So they're experienced in the classroom using experiential education as a way to engage and prepare students for the future and their careers. The focus of this webinar today is actually navigating uncertainty in higher education. Of course, this is something that stems from COVID, but uncertainty has been a feature of education for the last couple of decades, with a lot of changes happening almost overnight, seemingly. And so we really want to include a dialogue, yes, about COVID, but also about what is changing beyond just maybe what has expedited because of COVID. So we'll be getting into that as well. We have wonderful panelists here with us, and all of the Q&A will be facilitated through the chat. So if you have any questions or you want to engage with the speakers, feel free to put a note in there, and our Director of Marketing, Abby Goldenberg, will help to facilitate that so that we can keep the audio clean. This video will be recorded and distributed to all you afterwards, so we appreciate that you're joining live, and we hope this is a really good experience. So for now, feel free to start using that chat. Hopefully by now, I'm imagining you're all very comfortable using Zoom. So feel free, if you want to get the conversation started, where are you calling from? What's your name, organization, and title? And how are you doing? How are you feeling? What are you looking to learn from this experience? And hopefully we'll be able to answer some of those questions. So I'm honored to be here with folks I consider my mentors, people who have influenced me to think differently about the way that CapSource approaches helping institutions with their experiential learning, but also the way that we serve students. And so I want to take a moment to introduce our speakers. I'll actually let them introduce themselves, share a little bit about their background, their school, what makes their perspective unique, and kind of what they're excited about for this session. So Paul, if you want to kick us off, that would be awesome.
Great, and thank you for having us, Jordan. We welcome the opportunity. So my name is Paul Szwed, and I'm on Cape Cod at Massachusetts Maritime Academy. We are a relatively small, mostly undergraduate institution, one of 7 state maritime academies around the country. So we have a focused mission, and looking forward to hearing everyone's stories. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. You want to go ahead, Crystal?
Yes, hi. My name is Crystal Guillory. I'm the Assistant Dean in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Houston downtown. We too are, we're getting bigger. We used to be relatively small. We're about 15,000, but we are a relatively new institution in the sense of we started in 1974. We have several master's programs, but we're mostly for 4-year degrees.
Thank you, Crystal. Reg.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Reg Rogers. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Missouri in Columbia. I'm in the Department of Chemical Engineering. Previously to Missouri, I was at Rochester Institute of Technology, which is a co-op university, so more of experiential learning. Here in Missouri, we are going through just transitioning, trying to deal with a 4-year program, but we have students who are also interested in doing co-ops. So I'm kind of helping, working with my department and program to kind of bring in that experiential learning from the aspect of what I've learned and gained while I was at Rochester Institute of Technology. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Reg. We're grateful to have you. All right, Ian, bring us home.
Well, hello then. My name's Ian McAndrew. As it says, I'm the Dean of Doctoral Programs at Capital Technology University, which is based midway between DC and Baltimore. But I live in Germany. At the moment, I'm in England, and I run the doctoral programs where we have students literally from all over the world. We have 4-year degrees, masters, and of course, doctoral degrees. And it's a pleasure to be here to share experiences and to hear discussions and debate.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, we're very fortunate to have all you guys. And I think again, to reiterate, there's such unique perspectives here, different types of programs, but at the end, they all are, within institutions geared to serve students, and they all can technically include experiential education as a way to engage and prepare students for the working world. So some of the topics that we're going to be covering today is, how is methodology shifting because of COVID? What types of experiential learning are you using? How have those needed to change because of fully online modalities? What are you doing to best prepare for these engagements? So on and so forth. And ultimately, again, we really do want to create a dynamic here that allows you to learn from these folks. So if there's something that you hear that you want to dive into further, feel free to let us know and we can try and address that. So I think the best way to get started here is to actually talk about the type of uncertainty that we're dealing with. So this is intended to set the stage. How is your school managing uncertainty? I'm sorry, this is the first question. I was like, that doesn't seem accurate. So what kind of uncertainty is there in education right now at your schools, or that you're seeing with your peer institutions and your colleagues? And how has this shifted and become a little bit more clear because of COVID? And I guess this is a question for anyone, so feel free to chime in and we can create a discussion around it.
Okay, if I start, and just a little bit, what we've been doing is we've been bringing back students on a rota, and we've been accommodating for students.
Oh, Ian, we lost your audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Yes, we've been doing a rolling sort of start with students and faculty coming in on a sort of time basis, twice a week for faculty, students coming in as necessary. But the thing that I've noticed is really a lot of people put an enormous amount of work into doing this. And the decision to stop it, change it, or override it is going to be held both state-wise and also federal-wise. And that could change overnight. And I think this is the difficulty that a lot of universities are facing, is that although they have plans, they could change within 36 hours. And it's nothing to do with their institution, the problems or the lack or the high levels of maybe COVID-19, but because there are political influences. And I think this is, for the people that I have spoken to, is the biggest sort of concern that they have. They're not controlling their own world anymore.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off that, what Ian just said, because here in Missouri and out in the Midwest, you can tell there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how being in a wide open area versus being in a big major city is changing how we approach education. Students are constantly asking, like, do they do a gap year? Do they just not go to school? Do they go to trade school? Do they do something different? And it's something that's hard for us as educators to figure out what is the best mode of trying to deliver the material, especially from an engineering perspective. How do you deliver engineering material from an online platform when most students are still trying to figure out what to do, just from financial reasons or from whether they're trying to understand if the university is going to maintain its certain protocols. Like right now here, we are doing a 3-tier method with in-person, face-to-face, doing blended hybrid mode, and then doing online. So a lot of students are constantly questioning and asking, is that going to be the same going into next semester? Is it going to be different? So we're always having to make those adjustments on the fly.
At our university downtown, we have offered 90% of our classes online and 10% face-to-face. For those 90% of them are synchronous or they are asynchronous. But we have found that we have offered enough variety for learning modalities. That's how we have, ventured in with this uncertainty, just making sure that we give our students several options so that they are comfortable with learning.
Thank you, Crystal.
So I'm hearing a few open mics, so I'll moderate for a moment. If you could mute if you're not speaking, that would be great. But when I look at these two questions, it feels like COVID has overshadowed everything, and I can't think of what the old uncertainty was. Other than for us in the state of Massachusetts, we had declining high school demographics, increasing demographics in terms of diversity. both of which present a challenge for our institution. But certainly the shift in COVID feels like it's been an accelerator. I feel like we've been sitting on top of an educational bubble for a while. And for me, it feels more like a bit of a reset rather than just a temporary disruption. So some of the impacts for us have been declining enrollments. I think we're down 9% at this point. I read a study overall from the American Council of Educators that they originally estimated the impact to higher ed would be $180 billion. And they pretty much blew through that by September. So it's been a significant change to the business model for higher ed. And I think that has continued in the classroom. And I think students and parents and families and influencers will be a little more discerning of our value proposition now that they've had a different form of delivery.
Wow, lots to cover here. So, quick recap, but we're talking about political influences, we're talking about financial implications and business model implications. We're talking about enrollment issues and changes. So I think there's lots here to chew on. And I guess, my next kind of question here is like, so far, what are schools doing to manage this uncertainty? Is this sustainable? Are schools planning to do this for the longer term? Or is this something kind of like a Band-Aid year just to get us through to next summer and then hopefully hit the reset button?
So I'll start. We've already decided to go into doing the same format here in Missouri, the same that we're doing right now. So we're going to have the partial face-to-face, partial blended, hybrid, and partial online. And that's going to be for next semester as well. And, whether or not that continues beyond that, we don't know. But again, it's kind of a day-to-day matter of understanding what the environment, the global environment is going to be like. And then we have to make those adjustments as they come along.
Yes, I second what Reg is saying. Our university is doing exactly the same thing, following the same model that we did this year, waiting to see, what happens.
For us, this fall, we were half capacity on our dorms, about quarter capacity in the classrooms, and mainly it was focused on those programs that had labs and required practical assessments, as well as our incoming freshmen. The spring, we've jostled that around. We traditionally have a 2-month winter sea term where our ship gets out to sea. But that's not likely to happen in January, so we've split that before and after our spring term. And we'll try and increase the number of students on campus, but it all depends on how this pandemic progresses, what it will allow us to do.
Yeah, it seems like a very agile perspective that each of your schools is taking, kind of ready to adjust based on changes in spikes in COVID, especially in certain areas. I think, I'm interested to hear from Ian, like how obviously you're based internationally, your school's in the U.S., how each region, depending on where it is, proximity to large cities or, states that have higher rates of transmission of COVID, how are those types of changes in the local region impacting the way that your schools make decisions?
I think before I start to answer that, I think there's a little bit of a preamble. And in Europe, we use this thing about the Reformation with Martin Luther King, and the change of the politics and the religion in Europe. And we often say, what are the institutions that are still around that were around before that happened? And if you look at the majority of them, they're universities. Universities adopt, adapt, and improve. And let's face it, most of us are working in institutions where we have a collective group of degrees per person, much higher than almost anywhere else that you come across. And if we cannot survive and we don't have the skill sets, we shouldn't have been a university to start with, I think. So I think there's a lot of benefits there's a lot of disadvantages of COVID, but it opens potential benefits. And if I talk about around Europe, in Germany where I'm based, everyone likes to follow the rules. If the government says a rule and people don't like it, they will still follow it. while there are other parts of Europe where people have a sort of a laissez-faire approach to some of these things. And I think that's probably fair as an outsider looking into America, and which is natural because humans are humans and they follow in different trends the way that they work. But we don't know at the moment, and I think there's too much emphasis on trying to look into a crystal ball to predict what's going to happen, whilst at the moment I would think the medium and long term is to really plan for the obvious probabilities that are going to happen. And of course, people are now talking about a third wave, but we hear about vaccines. So I think we have to plan for what is likely to happen. We can come back fully, we can't come back at all, or there's a sort of a blended version in between, which we're all doing. And I think we've got the experience to be able to switch into any of those three gears. Depends what happens.
I like that. It's almost about making wholesome change to the culture of the school and the curriculum and the way in which you serve constituents. I think, one of the interesting exercises I did with one of my mentors is kind of thinking about, who are the stakeholders and, dare I say, customers of higher education. And we actually said, faculty are technically, in some form or another, a customer of the higher ed environment. So are the students, so are employers. So are alumni, so are the local communities. So there's lots of stakeholders here. And so really, if you think about it, there are ways to make wholesome changes to the way in which the administration and the faculty are thinking about change, thinking about addressing the needs of all those stakeholders through different mechanisms. Obviously, we're huge proponents of experiential education. We like to say that we bring all those stakeholders together through these types of industry collaboration with students, but ultimately there's lots of opportunity to make changes. The thing that we're seeing a lot of is schools shifting to Zoom, exclusively, but taking all of their old content and migrating that onto an online format exclusively. And we're starting to hear a lot of Zoom fatigue come to light, and students are distracted at home. There's lots of things that can pull their attention away, whether it's personal or familial challenges, or just inaccessibility to the internet and bandwidth that they need to engage properly in those courses. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how Paul has been thinking about curriculum. We've been working together for the last couple of years through a variety of different engagement formats, and especially professional development. Now that a lot of the in-person opportunities are no longer accessible, the semester at sea is no longer as easy to execute on. So how are you thinking about making these changes holistically to the way that you address your students' professional development?
So traditionally, we've required all of our students in the International Maritime Business Program to participate in 2 co-ops and 1 experiential learning program. And typically the experiential learning program, which is a really bad name for it, but it's an international field study where they'll spend 3 to 4 weeks overseas, engaged in another culture, and also learning about the maritime world from a different perspective. Travel restrictions and employers aren't keen on bringing on interns. So we've kind of pivoted and decided that we need to create online experiences. And so last summer, myself and a course, Youth Management Consulting as a frame, and we worked with CapSource to find a client to help them resolve their challenge. The students met twice a day, every day, which was pretty, provided some real value to their client, which I thought I saw a slide up there in a minute, which was Branch, which is a startup furniture business. And they were running into some of the same problems that we were. They were originally a business-to-business furniture outlet, and with COVID and employees going home, the work-to-home movement, the employers no longer needed this service, and so they had to pivot to a direct-to-consumer model, and our students help them with some of those challenges and change.
Thanks, Paul. I think I really like this example of a student experience, and wanted to just talk a little bit about the outcome. So obviously, we worked with a really incredible high growth company going through a whole bunch of changes as a result of COVID. They used to serve the enterprise business environment with office furniture, needing to figure out how to get a direct-to-consumer model out there. There's so many implications to this particular challenge, and a lot of them are about understanding the industry that branch operates in, the products that they work with, and the customer segments and how those are changing. And so the students are able to take the framework of project management and apply it to a specific project and think about, how would I approach this challenge when I'm entering the work, if I were in the workforce or if I were hired to be a consultant here. And there's no right answer. I think that's the key thing to remember about experiential education, is that it's not actually about being having a dynamic between professor and student with all the answers, and then the students really intending to get that answer exactly the way the professor would do it. It's actually more so about co-creating that environment, listening to the students about what their ideas are all about. So to quickly cover, we've used the live case method with Paul for the last few semesters. The whole concept there is one company can have many groups of students working on projects. It makes experiential learning scalable. It can be used in a traditional classroom environment. The other more popular format is capstones. Those are kind of a traditional engagement between students and company. And so you have one group of students working on a project, delivering real outcomes to real stakeholders. Often, though, you'll need several faculty to manage a large program, because we typically see one course load for faculty pretty much being about 3 to 4 capstones tops, which will really only accommodate up to about 25 students. So something to keep in mind when you're thinking about your formats. Of course, there's also single student engagement formats. Sometimes they're called co-ops. Those are obviously different to manage because every student's got their own project. So it's really a lot about reflection and making sure that they are developing the professional skills to interact with those stakeholders at the organization that's hosting them. Our process is simple. If you're interested in doing one of these engagements, we base all of our projects on the demands of our academic partners. So you tell us what you're looking for from a collaboration standpoint, a timeline standpoint, teaching goals, topics, industry, company size, location, modality. All of that stuff can be custom. We'll match you with the correct companies, design those projects so that it aligns your goals with the company goals, ultimately so that everyone wins, and help you launch it so that you can get the students excited and working. I love this slide. This is something that we're working on a lot recently. It's called the Experiential Bargain, and it really talks about the trade-off between students as experiential learners and companies engaging in experiential hiring. So what happens between those stakeholders is really an exchange of value, because ultimately the companies aren't paying the students are learning in exchange for that intellectual property access to key resources and personnel. And so they're applying theory to real projects with real stakes. Those companies are ultimately getting fresh ideas, cost-effective solutions. Students are developing skills and networking, while companies are able to train, onboard, and brand themselves as an employer that cares about that next generation and those insights from folks that are really going to be their future leaders. And then the outcome here is reference-worthy experience for students. And of course, from an experiential hiring perspective, they get to evaluate talent that could be a real fit for their organization and future leadership roles. So this actually talks about the role of institutions and educators in the experiential bargain. So what actually is happening here with Paul and his course, we're working together to organize these engagements, which includes enrolling those students, getting them ramped up and ready to go, finding the correct industry partner, designing that project so that there's alignment. The second phase is about actually launching and facilitating that program, right? Ensuring that the learning is the first and foremost priority, and that they're not really working, but they're actually learning by basically turning a real challenge into a case study that's interactive and current, rather than something that's written and historical. The students get to engage with those brands, and then ultimately we really want to make sure that they're meeting learning objectives so that we can provide accreditation and recognition for the work that these students are doing. So because they're not being compensated, because they're not employees, they're still getting experience, and they're able to attribute that experience to a real organization. They're enrolled in programs. So making sure that those program goals come to fruition, those project goals are completed, and that students are walking away with that reference-worthy experience is really what this comes down to. So in addition to the sourcing and design service, which is basically matchmaking, we offer a technology system so that schools can really do this at scale, especially for organizations that are trying to make this change over the long term and sustainably. And ultimately, we hope really queue up another business model where you're able to charge industry partners to collaborate with your students, because you are serving them as a stakeholder as well. So just another thing to keep in mind if you're thinking about this type of experiential learning. But we'll get back to the discussion here. So I know Reg and Crystal, you two have used co-ops and other forms of experiential learning. Wondering if you can kind of shed some light on the differences between a virtual environment to do this in versus the in-person kind of more traditional model, and kind of what needs to be different and changed in order to make this effective.
Sure, Krista, you want to go first?
No, go ahead, Reg.
Okay, so when I think of co-ops, those are the hands-on experiences, and from an engineering perspective, the students gain a lot with the hands-on interaction with a company, or whether it be in a research lab. And trying to do that virtually becomes a challenge, because basically you're taking away the actual face-to-face interaction. Seeing the hands-on learning aspect become nothing more than looking at a computer simulation, for example. If you're doing, say, for example, CAD or something like that, and just all you're doing is 8 hours a day, 48 hours a week, that becomes mundane at some point, because you want to be able to see that in action inside of a plant. Now, there's some, there's some advantages to this, and that, you actually can get a lot of information from the virtual aspect, just because you're building a platform. But I also look at it from the standpoint of, as an engineer, we need to be able to translate from what you learn in the classroom, from the theory, to what you can actually do practically out there in industry, because that's how you're going to gain those, I guess I call the nuances, so to speak, that you need to have to be able to get out there and get going. So by doing everything virtually, that learning, that extra step of getting the nuances and the actual intangibles underneath your belt go out the window. And so that is one of the major cons to it. But given what we have to do in terms of adaptability to the current situation and environment, we do have to make those changes when it comes to setting up co-ops virtually.
Thank you, Reggie. So at the University of Houston downtown, in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, that's the college that I work in. So our work has nothing to do with engineering. So we don't have those types of cons that Reg was talking about. But there is a pro that I want to talk about. The fact that we are doing everything virtually, this opens up the world to our students. We can work with people in Philadelphia. We can work with people in New York, Chicago, you name it. Just think about what's happening right now. We have a colleague on our panel who said that he's calling in from England. This is something that I think we should all take advantage of. If you can work with a company to where it's something to where you can do it at home, it's nothing, with engineering, then, or anything of that nature that really does require you to be, face to face, take advantage of that. I think it's always important to look at these times as opportunities to grow from. And that's just something that, I've seen at our College of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Houston downtown. And this is a time to be creative and just, see what we can learn. And I believe that the future will forever be changed because of this, because we can now collaborate, across the world.
I love that, Crystal. And it's also forcing industry to do the same thing, right? We're all home. We're all, among our families, need new spaces in order to work and collaborate using new tools. So CapSource, ever since we were founded, has firmly believed that we want the best talent. We use an experiential hiring process. And so ultimately our team is spread across 7 different time zones. And so we're able to collaborate virtually. And so giving students the advantage to try out that type of, across borders collaboration, across time zone collaboration is something that will ultimately serve them well into the future. And I think the other factor here is, becoming a leader within a technological environment is very different than being a leader in person. And so giving students the ability to understand what tools they have access to and how they can use them in order to take command over a specific situation. I know Paul's students had participated in a virtual live case competition we run every fall previously, but watching them, co-create all this content and deliver it completely virtually and get feedback virtually is something that they need to learn and experience before they graduate. And so I think there's opportunities here to really step into a technological landscape that they're going to ultimately be a part of well into the future. I love the cross-cultural, cross-border stuff. We've done quite a few programs overseas where, domestic U.S. schools will work with companies, in Peru, for example. And so learning about that economic situation, the culture there, all through a virtual mechanism is something that cannot be, done through a textbook, can't be done without a stakeholder on the other end. So I really do love those examples of pros and cons of virtual. So I wanted to see, are there any questions so far for the speakers that you'd like to ask based on what you've heard so far? We've covered a little bit of Paul Szwed's experience. We've talked about some of the challenges as a result of COVID and how some of these institutions, programs are managing that change. But are there other questions that you think would help you better understand kind of the experiential landscape that we're referring to here, and ultimately the ways in which we set them up in a virtual environment so that it could work for all of the stakeholders involved? So if you do have questions...
Or may I just stop? Why anyone's typing in their questions and things? If I could just sort of put another perspective on this with COVID, I think we've done incredibly well with the students that we have on the 4-year degrees. But let's think about the bigger picture as well. Those come in to be studying with us now and next year will have a totally different experience at high school. And they will have been zoomed to death. I think someone used the phrase a couple of moments ago. Their learning style will be very different from those that we have traditionally taught. Now, my observations, and these are observations rather than scientific data, is that attention span sometimes with a larger and larger group of students coming in is perhaps not as great as it was. And when we were sitting in lectures, or last year or 2 years ago, when any of you were lecturing to a group of 30, 40, 100 people, you controlled the lecture because they were in there, and it's very difficult for people to sort of switch off, go to sleep and everything else. And some of the best sort of faculty are good at controlling people in a classroom. That's a different skill set that is needed, one, by the faculty when you're Zooming, and two, by students being in a class, because you can be more anonymous. And you can also say, oh, my camera's playing up, and different excuses like that. And we're perhaps not fully ready for the next lot coming in and their challenges and weaknesses that we need to be working with. And maybe it's the time now, we're talking about planning for the future, of thinking about assessments which maximises what they have and not penalises what they don't have at the moment.
I like that perspective. Thinking about the difference, Gen Z is a totally different generation. We're actually officially transitioning all the while COVID is setting in and changing things all around us. But Gen Z as a generation has been kind of constant feedback loop with apps. I like to say that the millennials are digital natives. Basically having all this technology introduced to their lives while they were growing up. But the next generation, a lot of people are calling them Zoomers as Generation Z, are digital dependents, right? They understand technology. They're dependent on it to get the outcome. So what are the next generation students going to expect when they arrive in the classroom, and how is that going to change? How does education need to change in order to meet them where they're at when they're starting, especially considering how much COVID from a high school and K-12 education level has adapted the way that they're thinking about the world. Abby, do we have any questions before we move on?
Sorry, I was on mute there. No, I think we're good for now, but I did write a message in the chat. If anybody wants to ask me questions, we can put them here also throughout the session. It doesn't have to be addressed at this time. We can definitely prompt them in.
Thanks, Abby. All right, so moving on, we wanted to talk a little bit about how to manage the expectations and the relationship with these industry partners. You're almost adding a totally new stakeholder to the context of the classroom and the learning dynamics. So how do you use that to ensure outcomes and really make sure everyone's on the same page and achieving a good experience?
While people are thinking about that and talking about the expectations and the experience, students are changing. And I sometimes think people forget. And if I looked at the math that I studied when I was training to be an engineer, it was very different. Well, it was noticeably different from those what my sons studied before they started to become engineers. And where we would concentrate on, algebra, trigonometry, and calculus, my sons, they concentrated with statistics and mechanics and different things like that. And there is this thing, and I think that will happen faster and faster now over the next few years, as the syllabuses or syllabi will have to change and will change, reflecting on what is happening and what is needed. And this one-time-fits-all doesn't work anymore. And as faculty, we probably remember when we were studying, we had a brilliant professor teachers, but he probably hadn't updated his notes in 25 years because they were adequate. That wouldn't work now, because if you're in a class and you're at a blackboard and a piece of chalk, you could use your character, you could use your skill and get the people through. I think characters are lost by faculty when it comes to zooming into things. Some of the great faculties that I know, that students love them when they're in the class. That ability to come across as a dynamic faculty is lost a little bit on Zoom. And, some students, some faculty are dynamic, and that pulls a lot of the weaker students up. But if that can't come across, well, then we need to be questioning how we assess the number of assessments, how we divide classes up every week. And every faculty has a strength in one or two areas, but very few have strengths in all of the areas. And pick and mixing is something where we have the opportunity now, I think, with Zoom.
Oh, wow, that's a pretty interesting idea. So mixing up the educators and mentors and facilitators involved in the learning experience rather than the traditional model of kind of one-to-one. Obviously a drastic change in enterprise resource planning, but at the end of the day, how can we mix things up, switch students into different courses, switch educators into different courses to give them a taste of what else is out there. I really like that.
But then Eric just put a question up. Think big picture. And Crystal mentioned something about him thinking internationally. And sorry, Crystal, just to sort of use you as a point here, you were talking internationally, you were talking New York and different things like that. But look, this is a non-American talking here, looking in. Think international. And for example, we have now, or we're in the final stages of linking up with a university in Krakow, Poland, for a couple of things where there are people in the world that perhaps could not afford to come and study in America because it can be very expensive and to live. So we now have this opportunity where students believe and are ready and are experienced of being taught online with Zoom, where they could come and join the final year of an American 4-year degree. And they may use their own bachelor's degree in Europe or somewhere else. And they can join in online, and you can get more students. They could finish with an American degree without the cost of actually living in America and all the sort of the process of getting there. Or maybe they could be able to do it in split way. You could do one semester in America and one from your home country or wherever you were. And you could complete the final year of a bachelor's or do your master's that way. And you think of the potential that offers. It opens up a whole new world. As Aldous Huxley said, it's a brave new world out there. American education is seen as a gold standard in many parts of the world. And yes, most institutions here and things are opening up to say, look, we'll have students coming. One, at the moment, they can't come to America if they're not American national. But two, that's not a problem anymore. Recruitment can truly be international. And we all know of students that would love to come and study at our institutions, but cannot afford it because of the cost of being in America. Now, that problem's disappeared. And it opens up these different ways. We could have classes, and we could have classes with people from several countries, a link with an institution where they come and take one of your statistics or thermodynamics or structures or humanities or history class. They could earn American credit from abroad, and they're in the class. That is an opportunity, and I think we're thinking, what do we do with COVID? What do we do after COVID? Well, there will be an after COVID. And if we're progressive, there's a whole new world out there. And on the PhD, for example, and it's really COVID has accelerated us on the PhD at Capital of internationally recruiting, because people are more confident, they're more capable of dealing with these mediums. And we now have people from all over the world, where I think 18 months, 2 years before, it would have been much more difficult. Now, all of those that are concentrated on 4-year degrees, you think of that, the Maritime, and all the things all over the world that need maritime degrees, would love the American maritime degree, but can't get to America and can't study it. That's gone now. Not a problem.
Yeah, and Ian, I love this this riff, because I think this is actually really interesting. We got a question. And I think it's interesting because it actually talks about how do you persuade administrators and those who kind of control the types of programs that are offered, the marketing of those programs to prospective students, the enrollment of those students, the management of those. There's lots of bureaucracy and different departments that need to be involved in launching something like this. So how do you persuade administrators to go along with piloting some of these initiatives to test things out?
Well, they can be cheap, for example. I mean, it was last year that I was an external examiner at a PhD defence in Australia. And that wouldn't have happened before. They wouldn't have paid for me to fly to Australia to examine it. It happened to be an area that I was very recognised in. They wanted my skill set. But now, with the likes of Zoom, those remote things. So if you're an R1 type of institution with researchers, it's easier now to work with other researchers and to share laboratories. Double the laboratories, and you more than double your resources of doing research. Having strengths of researchers coming into your institution, or even guest lecturers from other parts of the world coming in on your undergraduate, which is free. And people are happy and competent to do that. And when administrators see the benefit for research, service, or teaching quality, they're going to be the ones probably pushing us once they get to that critical mass, in my experience anyway.
Yeah, and I like that.
To jump in also.
Go ahead, Paul.
No, I was going to just reply to that question about persuading administrators, and I think it goes back to your comment about generational change, and students of today and tomorrow are going to demand and need different types of learning. And this kind of goes in line with a couple of the comments I saw in the chat regarding focus and attention and discipline, or whatever you want to call it. And I think the challenge for us, particularly in the online environment, whether we call it experiential learning or active learning, is we need to figure out ways as educators to tap into that generation's talents. And I haven't read it recently, but a while back I was reading some of the literature on the neuroscience, and essentially the digital brain is wired differently than its analog partner, and so long form reading is not necessarily something that they're skilled at. They have other skills, and so the more we can tap into some of those talents, particularly with experiential learning and active learning, where they're not, someone called it the transmission model, where they're not just getting material pushed at them, where they're actively involved in the creation of that learning. That's what we're going to have to try and do, and are doing. But we have to adapt, and I think the persuasion is difficult. It's not clear cut, so it's a challenge.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off that. One of the things I noticed is that students like to get things in bits, and they look for the critical information small data bites, not necessarily like in page-long problem statements, for example. So if you're asking them to sit down and read an entire like 3 or 4 pages of a documentation to try to come up with all the information they need to have, many times they will give up or just say, you know what, I just need to highlight it. Can I scan through? Just tell me what the numbers are, and then try to take that information and assimilate an answer with it. And so we do have to adapt to say, okay, how are the students trained to learn today versus how the students were trained to learn, 2 or 3 years ago? Because it has changed. It significantly has changed, and that's something that, even if we go to administrators and say, we have to change our platform for how we're going to engage these students, that is going to be requiring all of us to sit down and say, what is the new generation thinking about? How are they approaching looking at an analysis, and not just saying that, well, this is how it should be done because this is how it was trained to do it. We can't do that anymore. We really need to take time to say, how are you able to learn, and then how can I adapt my teaching style or whatever it may be to seeing how you are able to learn to make it more effective so that you can be successful.
I just want to say that I appreciate what Paul and Reg just said, and those are student-centered, perspectives. Jordan talked earlier about the different, the population of people that we serve. And I know at our institution, we are very aware that we are here to serve our students. For many of our students are first gen in college. So I just wanted to say that, I'm happy the conversation went towards that way. So for the person who asked that question, at our university, whenever we want to persuade administrators, we make sure that we go to the student. We have surveys so that we can get some hard, results so that administrators can see it, in real time of what our students are thinking and feeling about how do we best serve them.
I love it. We've talked a little bit now about kind of the micro content movement, micro experiences, micro credentialing. I mean, it's basically like reducing the burden on the students as consumers and allowing them to have an easier but maybe more wholesome experience trying to navigate and find what they need. It kind of reminds me of this joke I heard. Where's the best place to hide a dead body? The second page of Google, because no one goes past the first one, right? So at the end of the day, these students are, whether we want to bang our head against the wall saying, hey, you need to check your sources, make sure that they're valid, they kind of blindly rely on Google to do that for them, right? And so now we're living in a world where they're connecting with our classrooms via Zoom exclusively, right? That the whole model of the educator sage on the stage is so different now because it's now your box and their box are right next to each other, and we're all kind of in one environment trying to create a dynamic that works for everyone as you work towards your teaching goals. And so thinking differently about your teaching goals, surveying students about their experience, what they want more of, what can make their learning experience more impactful, I think is such good practice in trying to change the way administrators look at their responsibility as as leaders within the academic organization. And I guess the last thing I'll mention here is I've always looked at institutions as the innovation hubs of the world, right, of their communities. And now community is defined so differently because it transcends borders and time zones and cultures and all that good stuff. And so now you're able to take, students from, disenfranchised backgrounds and mix them with students that had different experiences growing up, and let that, permeate and create a dynamic so that those students all graduate more worldly. We can start to set the standards and expectations around, what effective collaboration and communication looks like in a virtual environment, and how, we could use these tools to help real organizations solve their problems. And that's what I love the most about the experiential learning model, is it really kind of forces institutions to continue to think about innovation and the way that they approach problems as also part of training and educating students. So are there any good practices that you guys have experienced in this virtual Zoom environment that you'd like to share that you think might help as educators think about reducing that fatigue, creating much more micro experiences, generating results for those students that are participating?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, please go ahead, Paul.
Thanks, Crystal. And just to kind of echo what you were talking about, we recently reached out to some of our students and to check in with them. So we had our student leaders check in with students from all of the 4 undergraduate classes. And I think this is where it comes into the question. Some of the sentiments that were expressed, one, they prefer synchronous to asynchronous. Cameras on, they want to see each other, so it has the feel of a classroom. They like having activities and breakouts. So if anyone's using Zoom, the breakouts are a great way to allow them to engage in a small group on a focused problem. And, there's lots of, so those are 3 things that came back to us. They're not any mysteries, but came back to us from some student feedback on how the semester was going. And so I'll just throw that out there as kind of 3 obvious ones. And I'm sure the other panelists have some more interesting ideas.
Yes.
I'll go on, Chris, for you first.
Okay, yes. I was just going to say that Paul took my breakout room example I was going to use. So it's very important to make sure that students can engage, within a virtual learning environment. And Ian, I loved what he said earlier when he said bringing in people from not just across the U.S. because, most of us are Americans here, but I love how you said making it international and that people are, willing to do it and it's free. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ian.
Right, thank you. Yes, I think sometimes we do need to think as if how we Zoom lecture. We break things down more into a Zoom session. By aligning the sessions more to the assessment, I think that can give benefits. And let me sort of suggest this as a sort of an alternative and ways to look at things. We get interaction when we're actually physically in a class. And we can use that interaction. And we can pull people along. And we can physically see that some people look like they're struggling. Some people look like they're bored because you're not going fast enough. And you try to, and if you use math as a classic example, if someone's really bored because they're bright and doing a good job, as faculty, you'll go around and say, well, try these couple of questions. Or what happens if you change this parameter? Or it becomes negative rather than a positive integer. And with other people that are struggling, you can go and give them individual attention by saying, right, well, let's go back a step and try this. We can still do that in Zoom. And as has been said, the breakout sessions, we could divide people into struggling, okay, and the gifted and talented. And we can have material for those to push the really high achievers, to pull up the ones that are struggling, and to make sure we keep the ones in the middle so their attention going and things. And the breakout room assigned with assignments or tutorials that may not necessarily be formative rather than summative. That can help us by doing that. But that needs to be in the syllabus, and that needs to be planned, and students need to know that identity. And also, I think it was Reg was saying, and I was talking about the attention span. That is also a strength. And if you think about the attention span, we moan that students don't have a very good attention span. But if you talk to a producer or a director from Hollywood, they will moan that people who go to the movies don't have a very good attention span. So therefore, the last 15 minutes of the film for the conclusion must all be in 15 minutes. And they break up the films so that we don't get bored and they swap it around. We need to remember that sometimes in our class. And, sometimes we can come ill-prepared with 3 slides with 6 bullet points on each. And we're confused at the end of a session if students don't look enlightened. If we haven't planned properly, and I think the biggest risk, and sorry, I'm hogging it a little bit here. Nearly 30 years ago when I started at university, I was given a piece of advice by a very seasoned old academic who said to me, every year you enthusiastically start upgrading your first lecture again, your second lecture. If you take that approach, you will retire and your last lecture of the semester will be exactly the same as the one when you started teaching. And sometimes you have to shuffle things up by looking at the last lecture in your series rather than the first one. Because I know I do it. You're all, I have a good class. I'm going to update the notes for next year when I do that and start on lesson 1. Let's remember the ones at the end. because I think that sometimes, and particularly with Zoom fatigue, if our last lectures are not sharp as they should be, but then I can understand why they switch off.
Wow.
I want to just follow up on that and just say that, when I've had to use Zoom to do my classrooms or anything like that, I always like to tell people, no two lectures are alike. I can create one lecture one way, and then the next time it'll be the same topic, but it'll be completely different. Because what I'm trying to do is jumble it up so that students don't get that fatigue. They always come in wanting to know more. It's kind of like a movie, like you were saying, a movie, where I leave them in suspense at the end of one lecture, and then they want to come back and find out more. And by me using my creativity and imagination, I can induce that in them as well, and then they start to have that curiosity come out. Once the curiosity starts flowing, the sky's the limit at that point in what you can do with this virtual classroom. So, while I'm a proponent for mixing it up and having face-to-face majority just because of what I teach, but at the same time, I also know how to translate that from that classroom physically in person to this virtual world where they still are encountering the same learning environment. It's just changed, just adapted to a different setting, and then the students still can have some fun while trying to learn best the concepts they need to learn.
Yeah, so it's really good discussion here. I think if you boil it down, we're looking at a next generation. They have totally different engagement protocols, and I think at the end of the day, we're all competing, with all of the 12 devices in front of them for their time and attention. And, I just watched The Social Dilemma, which is a Netflix special that talks about the complexity of these apps that are basically doing everything in their power to cannibalize every moment that they can of these, young individuals, adolescents now, coming on to young professionals. Just get them to sign back in, to engage, to look at notifications. And so, every one of these things is happening while you're trying to teach them. And so I love that, Reg, you suggested taking a note right out of a movie producer and ending with a cliffhanger, ending with a question, ending with something that gives them the drive to come back and re-engage in the course content. And I think ultimately that's what experiential learning is, right? It's allowing the student to experience that content and that environment, that learning environment, so that they can take it with them and really learn from that experience, right? Take something. And I always go back to the industry integrated version of experiential learning. This Zoom question kind of reminded me of a lot of the dialogue that happens as a Facebook group called Pandemic Pedagogy, which has a lot of educators. I think it's 30,000 now from all over the world that are just talking about all the different tactics that they're using to try and keep people engaged amidst the pandemic. So I recommend taking a look at that. We also have an Experiential Educators Facebook page as well, where we can have this kind of dialogue ongoing. So if you are involved on Facebook, please feel free to join us. I do want to say thanks to each of you guys. This was such an incredible session. There's obviously so much meat on the bone when it comes to uncertainty. So there's broad strokes here. Hopefully you see, especially with Paul Szwed's example, that experiential learning, especially integrating real projects with industry into the curriculum, could be a really meaningful way to make that classroom dynamic pretty engaging for the students. It also teaches them the skills that they need to succeed in groups, which is pretty much how everyone works, virtually, which is now how we're all engaging with each other, and in a productive way, right? At the end of the day, students are paid for the capabilities that they bring to the table, and if they're selling their brain, right, they're ultimately trying to sell their brain, they need to be able to have reference-worthy experience to talk about. And so that's what each one of you as an experiential educator is doing for your students, is providing them with that context and perspective to share with prospective employers. So I wanted to highlight, so each one of the speakers here today has an experiential educator's profile, which discusses what they mean when they say experiential learning. We understand that is a topic that is robust and requires a lot of deep dives and digging. So we highly recommend checking into these articles and the articles that came directly from the speakers that were here today. They're really interesting. Each one has a unique perspective to bring to the table. We encourage all of you to join our network. You can also profile yourself as an experiential educator. We'd love to feature you if you have not yet been featured. That's part of our network, right? We're all learning from each other. We're trying to help schools become that innovation center once again. And we could really do that if we focus on, serving those students, but also making it easy for you guys as educators and administrators to make those changes and really ensure that the students are put first and foremost. So just wanted to cover some upcoming events for CapSource. We just announced a live case competition with the Ronald McDonald House of Jacksonville. Really fortunate that students are able to work not only on challenges, but challenges that impact, families and people's lives. A nonprofit that's trying to figure out ways to engage their volunteers virtually. So same types of challenges across the board, but now you're getting students to actually think for the purposes of benefiting an organization. And we also have another spring live case competition that'll be coming up next semester. So we definitely recommend participating in that. Ronald McDonald House, it's all virtual. As many teams as you want can participate. For the spring, only one team per school. So we definitely encourage you all to get involved. I just wanted to mention hats off to Oregon Tech for winning the case competition last time. All 4 of those students were provided full-time offers at CoinSource. So this is just an example of what reference-worthy experience could do for these students and how it really drives professional development for them. And I wanted to kind of highlight what that professional work experience looks like on a LinkedIn. Like this is a student that participated in a capstone based on a project that was provided by Verizon. So this is what we're ultimately providing to students. This is what ultimately drives the results for them as they embark on their careers. So with that, I'll say thank you. We're happy to hang on for a few minutes to answer some more questions if you have them, or you want to say hello to our speakers. I know Paul needed to run, but just wanted to say thanks for your interest in CapSource and navigating uncertainty, especially with experiential learning as a tool. We're here to help, and we're grateful that you've taken some of the time to really learn from us and exchange ideas, because that's really what community is all about.